Paris is the director of Foundation House, the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture. He's been on various government advisory boards for refugee settlement. He was particularly prominent, or became particularly well known, when he was appointed in 2012 to the Prime Minister's expert panel on asylum seekers, and I imagine that about this and many other things we'll be hearing from him now. He has so many distinctions, as everybody here, apart from the guy who's talking, have, that I won't continue with them except to mention one last distinction which is close to my heart, and one that he shares with Julian, with Peter, and I think with Julian McMahon, who will be speaking tomorrow. Once a year, I enjoy giving a 2-day course on justice and society for the Cranrana program in Melbourne, together with the Melbourne barrister David Neal, who chaired last year's event here. You would have met him then. Paris, Julian, Peter and John are all alumni in good standing of that course, and I'm delighted to see them tonight. I like to think that I taught them all they know, and that might not be true, and even if it is true, it might be nothing to be proud of, and that's something that you'll have to determine in the next hour or so, and I ask Paris to begin persuading you that it is true.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Martin, and Peter, for the invitation to talk to everybody here tonight. You may think, after listening to me, that Martin and I have spoken before this talk, but I promise you we only caught up about an hour ago, well after I wrote this. But my 20 minutes starts now. That wasn't counted. No. I've been asked to speak about the themes of justice, liberty and fairness in relation to refugee issues internationally, regionally and domestically. The allotted time of 20 minutes might be a bit tight to do that thoroughly, so I propose to make some observations about a few of many possible issues of concern at a global level and with respect to Australia and its relationship with our region. The global scale of injustice is staggering and mind-numbing. Let me quote from a recent document, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It said, "Record numbers of people have been forced to flee their homes and are displaced within and across borders as a result of persecution, violent conflict, extremism, human rights violations, disasters, as well as now emerging megatrends such as climate change. An increasing percentage of displaced people are also caught in protracted refugee and international displacement situations with their exile lasting sometimes for several decades in the absence of solutions." As of the end of 2014, and these numbers are important to contextualise things, as at the end of 2014, the number of people forcibly displaced as a result of conflict and persecution was nearly 60 million, including 13.9 million newly displaced in that year. It had been 37.5 million a decade before. Among them are 19.5 million refugees. 45% of the refugees, almost 9 million people, were in what UNHCR calls a protracted situation, defined as one in which 25,000 or more refugees of the same nationality have been in exile for 5 years or more in a given asylum country. There were 33 such protracted refugee situations. In 1994, the average duration of one of those protracted situations was 9 years. At present, the average duration has grown to about 20 years. A recent UN report stated that in some protracted situations, refugee situations, a third generation of children are born into displacement. In the opinion of the UNHCR, the Syria situation was poised to become the largest protracted refugee and displacement crisis of the decade. The UNHCR estimates that there are over 12 million Syrian people of concern to the agency. Of these, 7.5 million are internally displaced, trapped within the borders. and 4.8 million are refugees and asylum seekers. There's been pressure to increase the number of resettlement places in the light of the conflict in Syria beyond the 100,000 places on offer each year at present. However, even if the international community quintupled that figure immediately to 500,000 places and not one more person became a refugee, it would still take 39 years to settle them all. So while it is vital to increase global resettlement places, it is clearly not the answer on its own. A few months ago, the head of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, wrote an opinion piece urging people not to call the flow of Syrian refugees to Europe a crisis, on the grounds that the numbers of people involved was a very small proportion of the region's population. His plea was in vain, as we know that this is the perspective of a significant number of European governments and has caused very profound rifts between them. Importantly, many experts in this field are increasingly concerned about the extent to which the crisis in Syria and the subsequent implications for Europe is absorbing the vast bulk of international attention at the expense of other large-scale crises in Africa and elsewhere. The Dadaab refugee camp with 300,000 refugees is one case in point. So we can see from a global perspective the nature, complexity and extent of injustices are profound. But what about the Australian perspective on the other side of the ledger? Let me begin with some positives. Australia continues to have one of the largest refugee resettlement programs in the world, and further expansion is scheduled from the current quota of 13,750 to 18,750 on an annual basis in 2018-19. On top of that, the government announced an additional one-off 12,000 places of people fleeing the conflict in Syria and Iraq. There's considerable public support for resettlement of refugees. In comparative terms, our resettlement program is both substantial numerically and very well funded for the provision of key services. In fact, the former UNHCR High Commissioner, Mr. Antonio Guterres, praised Australia for having what he felt was the best settlement services in the world. There's been some controversy this week over comments made about the difficulties of resettling refugees who are illiterate or innumerate and what that meant for the cost to taxpayers. I don't want to give those comments too much oxygen, given that they're made in the context of an election campaign with all of the baggage and loaded intent that such a context brings. The first point to make, though, is that we invite refugees to resettle and become members of the Australian community. They are therefore not taking jobs away from Australians. They are Australians. The issue of successful settlement and employment outcomes is a valid one for governments to consider. However, the simple truth is that we have had one of the most successful resettlement programs for over 60 years. We've resettled more than 800,000 people from a diverse range of countries and socio-economic backgrounds. We've done it extremely well, and many have gone on to be successful in business and in community life. I also have absolute confidence that we can, as a country, resettle many more refugees while also improving their employment and settlement outcomes at the same time. On the negative side, the injustices is the treatment of asylum seekers who came without valid visas. That is so in the case of both those whose claims for protection are being processed in Australia and those transferred to Nauru and Papua New Guinea. As Martin said, I was a member of the so-called expert panel who in 2012 was asked by Prime Minister Gillard to provide advice on how best to prevent asylum seekers risking their lives by travelling to Australia by boat. The terms of reference for the panel were: the panel will provide advice and recommendations to the government on policies available and the efficacy of such options to prevent asylum seekers risking their lives on dangerous boat journeys to Australia. I was of course aware of the considerable scepticism about the government's motives for establishing the panel. But in spite of that scepticism, I accepted the invitation because I had come to the position that from a moral perspective, the increasing rate of deaths at sea had reached a point and was on a trajectory that I could personally no longer accept. In approaching this issue, I held the firm belief, and still do today, that people smuggling has flourished not because asylum seekers have a preference to engage them, but because the international community is yet to develop a system that would make what smugglers offer unnecessary and therefore irrelevant. A system that would stabilise populations, properly care for them and process them in a timely manner. In that context, the growing phenomenon of people smuggling and increasing death toll from such ventures are as a consequence of both the criminal actions of smugglers and the hopeless inaction of governments. The strategies of governments and oppositions have for years been dominated by a desire to generate electoral capital by presenting themselves as unwaveringly tough on border protection. This emphasis holds precedence over responding to the protection needs of asylum seekers, and therefore compounds their situation and diverts the suffering elsewhere. A failure to appreciate that the people at the centre of global human displacement need, deserve and ultimately will seek out the safety they crave makes for bad policy. Importantly, policy proposed by understandably and appropriately concerned advocates, such as myself and others, academics and community members, that fail to fully appreciate the dangers that people smuggling generates and the regional and domestic politics of the issue are also badly flawed. Policies with such shortcomings will also inevitably lead to higher death tolls and diminish public confidence in how we manage these issues. The debate and policy thinking has become a binary argument, predicated on the false assumption that there is an inextricable link between harsh deterrence measures and as the means to preventing people smuggling. But this is simply untrue. Treating people seeking asylum humanely and preventing people smuggling are not mutually exclusive exercises. They are in fact complementary and should go hand in hand. Such dilemmas are what policymakers refer to, this is where you'll think Martin and I were talking, as wicked problems. They're characterised by a high resistance to resolution. There's often disagreement about the causes of the problems and the best way to tackle them. Attempts to address wicked problems often lead to unforeseen consequences. Wicked problems usually have no clear solution, may never be completely solved, and the challenge is to find the best way to manage them instead. And wicked problems are also socially complex. They involve coordinated action by a range of governmental and civil society stakeholders. So these characteristics and the wider global picture outlined earlier, given these characteristics and that picture, how do I believe concepts of justice and fairness could be incorporated into policy formulation? Firstly, practicality and fairness should take precedence over theory and inertia, and no single focus can provide an effective basis for policy making. This is true whether the focus is on better protections for asylum seekers or on disincentives to discourage them from taking dangerous maritime voyages. Strategies need to shift the balance of Australian policies and regional arrangements to give greater hope and confidence to asylum seekers that regional arrangements will work more effectively, and rather than denying asylum seekers the right to take those terrible risks, there is a responsibility to create opportunities that would enable their claims to be processed more fairly and effectively and in ways that make those risks unnecessary. That was the centrepiece argument of the panel in making the case for a regional set of arrangements that would provide the best basis for managing these issues. In spite of our pleading, the inability of the Parliament to agree on the implementation of the entire package as an integrated whole saw a reversion by that government and others since to punitive deterrence strategies that have pulled us to the position we now find ourselves in. Measures such as arbitrary detention, harsh living conditions and lengthy delays in processing and resettlement, for example, are not effective or necessary components in tackling people smuggling. People smugglers don't care about such measures anyway, and the conditions many people are fleeing are far worse. The only guaranteed outcome from such approaches is that they inevitably cause severe psychological harm with tragic consequences. The self-immolations on Nauru recently and the at least 7 suicides of asylum seekers in Australia between 2014 and 2015 are proof of that. The government can rightly claim that it has stopped people smuggling ventures to Australia from succeeding and, more importantly, preventing further deaths at sea. This is a good thing and important to acknowledge, but should not be achieved at any cost. A guarantee that responses will treat all people humanely and decently is just as important. Now we're in strife. From my point of view, in spite of the claimed success to date, it remains to be seen how sustainable the current arrangements are, particularly as there has been no effective progress towards a workable regional system and no decent resettlement for those found to be refugees on Manus Island and Nauru, or for those awaiting processing in Australia. A strategy characterised by justice and fairness would necessitate these two elements, and if they are absent, which is currently the case, then sustainability will become very uncertain. So what could have the outcomes been had the integrated package been allowed to be implemented? Firstly, it would have ensured that any policy initiative needed to accord with our international human rights obligations, with mechanisms built in to monitor compliance with that principle. Our humanitarian program would have reached approximately 25,000 places per annum by now, with a trajectory towards 27 over the next 2 years. It would have added an additional 4,000 family reunion places per annum for asylum seekers and refugees to the family migration program. This would have brought the annual total of humanitarian visas to 31,000 and would have reduced the waiting time for family reunion from 22 years to 2 years. For those processed in any regional arrangements, be that in Nauru, PNG, Malaysia or eventually Indonesia, the central safeguards such as no arbitrary detention, decent and appropriate accommodation, educational and vocational training, employment opportunities, legal representation, merits review, health and mental health care and genuine resettlement pathways would have been a prerequisite. In spite of our pleading, the inability of the Parliament to agree on the implementation of the entire package as an integrated whole saw a reversion by that government. Oops, sorry, I've gone wrong page. Such arrangements would have enabled refugees to see a future for themselves and their families. They could have spent their time investing in ways that would have strengthened their ability to resettle as those opportunities became available. The proposed package would have ensured their eligibility for resettlement to Australia or other countries such as the US and New Zealand, and based on early work to improve regional systems, resettlement out of those places would have begun in late 2014 or early 2015. Of greatest importance is that we would have been 3.5 years into the development of a regional protection framework that could have stabilised populations in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, cared for them and processed them, and found one of several durable solutions. It would have been a system, for example, that could have immediately responded to the plight of 8,000 Rohingya adrift and dying in the Andaman Sea in 2015, as opposed to allowing many to perish before action was begrudgingly taken to rescue them. The only disincentive would have been that if a person chose to bypass the regional system, they would have been transferred back into it, cared for, processed and provided with a durable solution in a more timely and equitable fashion, along with other people in that process. There'd have been no case to support temporary protection visas, to ban family reunion, or to eliminate legal assistance for people lodging their claims in Australia. Perhaps the worst decision that was made subsequent to Prime Minister Gillard being removed from office was when Prime Minister Rudd took the position further by announcing that nobody who had sought to arrive in Australia by boat would ever be allowed to resettle here. a position quickly embraced by the Abbott government, opposition and then government. The denial of resettlement in Australia from those countries is now a bedrock policy of Coalition and Labor. In my view, this is also now the principal cause of psychological harm, extreme hopelessness and devastating desperation. I don't make these points as a defence of or argument for resurrecting the panel report along with its recommendations. It's virtually 4 years on now and there have been substantial shifts in global trends. I make these points to highlight that if we are to turn back from where we are now, we can't simply turn back to where we had come from. A new attempt at building a decent regional set of arrangements is required, but make no mistake, it will require an integrated package of a similar nature to that proposed by the panel. In this area of public policy, we would be very naive to think that what is on offer is a choice between the good and the bad. Either explicitly or implicitly, by design or necessary consequence, all the policy packages which have been seriously proposed have harsh aspects. Almost always more than is necessary, much more severe than is required or acceptable and guaranteed to cause harm. As a consequence, they struggle to withstand rigorous scrutiny as to their feasibility domestically or internationally or both. I think the scope for proper detailed discussion of the issues within Australia has been unduly constrained. Too often people of different views hurl assertions and insults rather than patiently listening to each other in respectful dialogue. I'm not suggesting that such dialogue will produce consensus, nor should it aim to do so. Of course, people will continue to have legitimate differences of view about competing ethical considerations, as well as judgments about the likely consequences of any course of action. But the quality of political decision-making can only improve if participants allow for the possibility that those with whom they disagree are not necessarily evil bastards or simpletons, but may be making points that warrant attention. In concluding, the question that confronts us all is how many people must continue to subsist and suffer for years in perpetual fear of their lives around the world, in our region and in our country, and how many must die from perilous journeys before all parties in this debate come together and identify fair, credible and just compromises that do not erode the edifice of our humanitarian responsibilities or allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. Thank you.